The Sistine Chapel at the Vatican is painted with many beautiful murals. Specifically, the highlight in the ceiling are 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. And one of the most prominent ones, and probably best known, is known as the creation of Adam. It has God up in the heavens surrounded by cherubs, and then a perfectly formed man, Adam, there, physically formed. God is reaching out to Adam with his finger and giving Adam the ability also to reach up to God and to be able to receive the gift of a soul, so that Adam, who was formed physically, now has something internally as well. One of the finer points of the particular painting, though, is that the 2 fingers don't meet, because the hand of God and the hand of Adam can never really come together. The fingers can't be totally there in connectedness, but rather God, with the gift of his grace, is able to give us a soul. And as I spoke about last week, the gift of a conscience. This idea of the creation of Adam is also depicted in our stained glass window here of the Annunciation, where you see the hand of God coming out, almost breaking through and reaching down to the sky. Notice that God's finger comes forth not in an accusatory manner, but rather one of helping. He's slightly coming out to the hand of man, to the finger of man, being able to reach out to give, because that's what God does. He doesn't point fingers, but rather it's an act of giving, an act of generosity and sharing. But you'll notice that the hand of man, almost intersecting there at the cross, is not also able to reach up, but there's that little red dot there because they don't exactly meet. And they cannot meet, but it's a point of encounter. As Pope Benedict Emeritus would say, that there was a divine encounter between God and man. And so there's always that little space in between where each one of us are called to find the presence of God in our own lives. God's finger is also talked about in Exodus chapter 31, verse 18, where it speaks about how Moses went up onto the mountain to receive tablets from God, to receive the law. And specifically, it speaks of how that the tablets were handed to Moses after God had inscribed them with his finger. So we have a very human side of God, something that each one of us has a finger. We can think about God using his own finger in order to be able to teach, in order to be able to give, to be able to share. And so today in the gospel reading, we also hear about the finger of God being used, not to break out of the sky, to give a soul in his image and likeness, not to write the 10 Commandments or the law, but rather God's finger being used in Jesus Christ to write on the ground. But here Jesus was apprehended by these people who brought him a woman who was caught in adultery. You kind of have to wonder, how did they know that she was adulterous? How is it that they brought her there to him? How is it that they said, oh, well, we're going to really maybe accuse her? But this is not as much a story of her as it is a story about Jesus and about how he's going to react to sinfulness. You see, adultery was something that somebody would be stoned to death for. That was part of the law, part of the Mosaic law. But the only people that could stone were the government officials, the Roman authorities. So Jesus was in a conundrum here, because if he said, well, go ahead and stone her, he would have been arrested at that particular time because he was going into the place of the Roman authorities, and he knew better than to do that. So he didn't want to do that, and he also didn't want to break or seem to be really soft on the Mosaic law or on the law of religion, because he knew that adultery was wrong. So what did he do? But he kind of knelt down and he took his finger and he started writing on the ground. Now, we have no idea what he wrote. Notice that there's nothing here specific that says, well, what did Jesus write? What was on his mind? And also, this is the only instance in all of the scriptures that we see Jesus writing. Again, something that each one of us, maybe we take it for granted, but there's a time and there's some people that they are not able to write. But we know that Jesus did have the ability to do that. Now it's thought, and apparently at this particular time in history, that when people were confronted with something, they would take that time to filter what they were confronted with. And so maybe they would kind of squat down and start doodling on the ground in order to waste time, in order to think of a response. There's probably something to that, because how often do we respond quickly to something, maybe without thinking about what our response is? Jesus gives us a good model here to say, spend a moment in quiet. Maybe squat down on the ground and start doodling a little bit if you think you're going to say something that you really may not want to say. So he was stalling, in other words. It was a very good tool, actually, that he was able to use. But then he stood up and he spoke there to the men who had brought this woman to him. And then he went down again and he started writing on the ground. The actual translation, the second time that he was writing, was that he wrote a sentence. He wasn't just doodling or writing some kind of drawing something, but rather he wrote something out. Again, we don't know what it is. Maybe it was something from Scripture that he had learned. After all, he was in the temple area, about judgment or about accusing. We don't know what he wrote. Maybe he wrote the sins of those Pharisees because he knew what they were. And he was reading their minds and their consciences. Maybe he wrote their names. He broke the seal of confession and he wrote their names and then said what sin they had next to it as well. Now maybe they did that because one by one they all walked away. So they saw something on the ground. It was disturbing to them. They saw something there that said, oh, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to stop accusing and judging this woman. And so they all walked away, and Jesus is left alone there with her. Again, something very odd in the Scriptures at that time in the culture for a man and woman to be left alone together, especially a woman who was adulterous. Most men would have said, well, I'm going to run because I don't want to be seen with her. I don't want to be accused either. But Jesus speaks to her, and he does it with love. And he does not say that she didn't sin. He just said, go forth. I'm not going to judge you, but go forth and sin no more. He didn't say she didn't sin, but he basically said, go forth and have a new start in your life. And a new life, have hope for tomorrow, that you will not go back on your sinfulness. So he doesn't really judge her, but he gives her a great message and maybe a standard of going forth, a command. And that's what the Lord wants us to take from this reading today. It's what a few years ago you may remember after he was elected Pope, Pope Francis said 5 words that he's going to be known for. Who am I to judge? And many take that in a very wrong way of like, oh, well, what do you mean? You know, you're just the supreme pontiff of the Holy Catholic Church keeping moral certitude in the world. You're called to judge, but the Pope is human too. And what he was saying in that is I give that to God. In the eternal judgment, there will be that opportunity for God to hand out and to speak to us in that way. And it does not mean that there's no standard. We have a moral standard that we are called to live. But we also have that ability to have hope for conversion and to have hope to be able to go forth, that whatever sinfulness we may have, we can change and we can turn our lives around to be able to live in the gift of God's grace. In the Matthew Kelly book, Rediscover Jesus, which we gave out at Christmas time, and many have come to me and said, oh, Father, it's wonderful. Thank you for giving it to us. And they've been reading it, and I'm very glad. So if it's sitting still on your coffee table or at home and it's not been opened, folks, it's time to open it, okay? I'm going to tell you today to go to page 76, I think it is. And there's a whole chapter in there on judgment and on judging. And Matthew Kelly spoke in the book, and he said, well, in a day, think of how many times you judge situations or people and start counting it. That you inflict your mind and your standard upon someone else about where they live, how they're dressed, what they look like, what they said, maybe that's not really our place to do. I ask you, go to the book and you will find it there. It's very well written and it speaks well, because really what it's saying is we are not created to point fingers. We are not created to take our finger, which God gave to us, which God used to infuse the soul into the man, which God used to write the law of which we are to follow, which Jesus used to doodle on the ground and to speak to us today about not judging. What do we use our finger for? Do we use it to point at other people? Or do we use it to point to God? And to point up to the sky and to say, you know what? I want to lead others to Christ. I want to lead others to God. To reach up and to realize we may never quite touch and get a handle on the hand of God. We may want to grasp onto it, but we might not be able to do that. But what do we use our own finger for? Because we are not called to judge. Nobody likes to be judged. Nobody should be doing the judging. We'll let God do that. We'll let Him create the moral standard and allow Him to be able to, through the gift of our conscience, allow us to determine right and wrong. But in the meantime, reach up and don't be afraid to see if we can at least try to touch on to the Almighty, to be able to feel the beauty of the gift of His grace and of His future.